它是一个古代的一个很优美的故事，俞伯牙与钟子期的故事。
Flattered by Gukin playing a 2,000-year-old tune, High Mountain Flowing Water, this is music we only play for our closest friends, says China's President Xi Jinping to the French President Emmanuel Macron. But what really happened during the meeting between the two presidents a couple weeks ago? Macron went to China to convince Xi to get him to put pressure on Putin to end the war in Ukraine. But on the plane back from China, Macron stated that Europe must resist pressure to become America's followers. China's president couldn't have asked for more. So perhaps it was the seducer Macron who himself was seduced. In this video, we'll take a look at the quite dramatic turn in geopolitical events these last couple of weeks and also see what our friend Peter Zeihan has to say about the matter. France has always wanted to be different when it comes to foreign policy, which includes a complicated history with NATO and Macron himself stating back in 2019 that NATO is becoming brain dead. Not very diplomatic if you ask me, and I guess Macron has changed his mind during the last year, but still emphasizes his belief that European independence depends on making choices devoid of any outside influences, especially from America. Moreover, Peter Zeihan explains that Chinese media is encouraged by the summit, and Macron's statement that Europe should take an independent stance on Taiwan leaves the door open for interpretation. To find out what all Zeihan has to say, as well as the perspectives of the EU and China after this visit, stay tuned to Profit Protection. But first, let's address why Macron visited China despite there being very obvious unrest at a home. At the EU meeting in Brussels on March 23rd, the main talking point was naturally the war in Ukraine, as it probably has been since it started. And as foreignpolicy.com would tell you, the EU-Chinese relations have been at an all-time low, so any way to salvage this relationship might contribute to ending the war. Another topic of importance is Macron's view on the China Belt and Road Initiative, which broadly intends to expand China's influence in the region and beyond. He's talked about the BRI in the past and mentions that China should be more transparent and collaborative in their infrastructure projects, which is a nice way of saying that we're threatened by how much you've expanded and we can't keep up. To help matters, Macron mentioned that Ursula von der Leyen would accompany him on his trip and the protests in France would not hinder his agenda. So, the key points we can take from the context behind this is that by strengthening ties with China, they might feel more inclined to oppose Russia and recognize that their sphere of influence is still limited. But plans are one thing and reality is another. So there was a lot of political jibber-jabber said by Macron and Xi Jinping that depicted their meeting as a bilateral effort to work together to make sure nobody's feelings were hurt. However, in a joint statement made by the PRC and the French Republic, there were 51 points made by both sides that laid out their commitments to one another. Kind of consider them as wedding vows. So starting with number 1, we've got... No, I'm just kidding. We're not going through that. But there is one that I want to discuss. So amongst all of them, the one that I want to address is France reaffirming its commitment to the One China policy, which, if you didn't know, is the idea that there is only one official China and that Taiwan is a part of mainland China. This is interesting because the topic of Taiwan is very touchy, and whoever has relations with them has to walk on eggshells to not accidentally recognize them as a state. So Macron's adherence to the One China policy is the same stance the rest of the West has taken on Taiwan and China, since as long as the United States is still a superpower, the One China policy is just a stopgap. Macron has also been saying that Europe must maintain an independent policy and not be subordinate to the US or China, but really what third option exists, since even though the EU tries to act as one, each country has its own interest at hand and alliances can be overlapping. As we all know, the United States is a close ally with Taiwan, and while they haven't officially recognized them either, they sure do everything and anything they can to help them out. This isn't anything new though. Most countries don't recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state, but during the Cold War, the US contained China by making allies in Southeast Asia, so they worked in America's interest nonetheless. And Peter Zeihan describes this in a lot more detail.
That the Americans have been orchestrating and creating this alliance in order to contain and beat them back. And during the Cold War, there was definitely something to that.
Moreover, I find France's commitment to the One China policy so amusing because whether you like it or not, each country that is allied with the US is more or less a mouthpiece for them. The trip itself was largely on the basis of the EU taking the first step to make up with China because the war in Ukraine is something the West firmly opposes, and China is the missing piece needed to truly cripple Russia. Not to mention Ursula von der Leyen being there to help help push the European narrative of this trip. But how do you make friends with someone that you've spent so many years trying to deter? Well, this isn't a the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of situation, because Russia's already made friends with China. So what did Macron really achieve in his visit? Well, if we're judging the success of his meeting on the merits of stopping the war in Ukraine, I can't say it was successful. Then again, it depends who you ask. China seems to think it went pretty well. And Zihan also goes into a little more detail on this.
France specifically and Europe in general don't have to follow the cue of the United States, kind of shows the degree of political disintegration within China has now even reached the diplomatic core.
Not to mention that Macron stood by his statements about not adapting the American rhythm or Chinese reaction on the matter of Taiwan. So as far as China is concerned, as long as France doesn't encourage the idea of Taiwanese independence or buckle to American pressure, everything works out just fine for them. But to really hammer this point, an NBC News article stated that the Chinese state-supported nationalist newspaper Global Times praised the recent events as a sign of the failure of the US strategy to draw Europe into containing China. Liu She, the Chinese ambassador to France, commented on Tuesday that Macron's remarks were a reflection of the French tradition of independence and that he spoke the truth. Despite these encouraging signs coming from the Chinese media, Politico elaborates on a conversation that Macron, von der Leyen, and Xi Jinping had. This is all according to someone that was in the room with them, so take from this as much as you want. Nevertheless, Xi was frustrated with the fact that the West was pressuring and antagonizing him for his visit to Russia, but was also critical that the Taiwanese president visited the US. Yes, the irony isn't lost on me either. Meanwhile, Ursula von der Leyen, who was also there with Macron as I mentioned, had a more critical view of matters according to SCMP. One report from a diplomat states that she felt humiliated that her and Macron shared different views on the EU's China policy since she intended to go into China to de-risk the situation. She elaborated by highlighting how the whole ordeal felt like China was trying to divide and conquer the EU based on the merits of the differences and interests of each individual nation, which is something that even ex-EU ambassador Nicolas Chapuis had gotten a sense of during his own visit to China years ago. So this brings me back to the secret informer and what the particular details were when discussing Taiwan. But let's also examine the situation that China finds itself simply within its own neighborhood, let alone beyond that. The threat of China attacking Taiwan is really slim to none, since they've been going at it for decades now, and a new threat from China is as likely as the sun rising and setting. The alliances that have been built up between the US and the various neighboring countries still pose a variable threat, and Zihan describes the obstacles that China faces in Southeast Asia when it comes to its region.
China without help from the United States. I'd be worried about the Taiwanese because while militarily they're not going to conquer the mainland anytime soon.
All in all, it's safe to say that Macron's visit didn't exactly achieve what he and his EU allies were hoping for. In fact, one could argue that he did the PRC a favor by giving the state media enough to chew on and leverage the summit as evidence that the US might be gradually losing its influence in Europe. The fact of the matter, however, is that despite Macron's desires of an independent Europe, it won't be easy to distance themselves from a century of alliance and cooperation with the United States, especially for as long as the US is a global superpower. Until then, we hope you stay tuned to Profit Protection, and we'll keep you in the loop for all things related to geopolitics, the economy, and just about everything in between. Make sure you subscribe to stay updated for our latest videos, and like this one if you found it informative. But for now, that's all from me, and I will catch you next time.